everyone. My name is Natasha Matthew, and I will be your host today for our drinking water webinar series. We're talking about realty and rural drinking water. And we also have on the call, we have Trent, Kelsey, Haven, and Marika, and a few other source water protection staff. But the ones that I mentioned, they will be helping us out today in the chat and providing technical support. And just before we start, we're going to go over some Microsoft Teams 101. Like I mentioned, the webinar will be recorded and available on YouTube in the following days. We ask that all participants stay muted, and if you can, turn your cameras off just because it'll help with the bandwidth. Additionally, if you do want to participate, you can talk to us in the chat function or the Q&A. And other than that, if you have any technical difficulties, you can contact Trent Boss. His email is already in the chat, but if you need it verbally said, it's trent.boss@ltc.on.ca. So now that we've got the MS Teams info out of the way, we'll begin with today's webinar, and we're going to go over a small presentation about something called the best practices for source water protection. And then we'll go over and we'll introduce our lovely guest today, Rick Lobb, who's going to discuss realty and rural drinking water. And then we'll end it off with a Q&A session. So to start off this presentation, we're going to find out if the property that you're looking at buying or the property that you're selling has a well or not. We're going to take you through a few steps to determine if you have one on the property. So the first step is pretty simple. You're going to look on the property. If you see one of these two items, they're both wellheads. One is a dug well or possibly a well pit on the left, and the other one is a drilled well. Occasionally, dug wells can be semi-buried or overgrown if there hasn't been a recent inspection or if the property has been vacant, so just keep an eye out for that. And then some well owners with drilled wells, they might try and make it more aesthetically pleasing. So when they're doing that, they might put this like rock cover over it so you might not see the wellhead. If that's the case and you can't find a well, but you think there is a well on the property, you can always ask the landowner. Another way to look at it too is if you are on a property that is close to a body of water, there may be something called a surface water intake. If you want to see if you have one of those, you can locate the pipe that goes into the water, or occasionally there'll be an above ground pump that kind of pumps that water from the surface into the household. However, this water is usually never recommended to drink because surface water can contain several contaminants that need a lot of treatment measures. That being said, just make sure if you are using surface water as your drinking water, just make sure that it is safe with the proper treatment sources. And then another way is if you're uncertain, you can always look to see if the house has a water meter. This technically means that the house is on municipal drinking water, so you can rule out a well being on the property. And then last but not least, if you are uncertain if the house does have a private drinking water system or not, you can always contact the municipality and see if the house is hooked up to municipal services. If the municipality says they don't have services going to that household, you can then ask the landowner. If the landowner doesn't know, then you can ask the Ontario Well Records website. And then if you can't even find the well record, because that's possible, you can always contact a licensed well contractor to help you locate the well. One of our panelists will put in some information and links for both of those websites for the Ontario Well Records and the well contractors. So once you've determined that the house has a well or a surface water intake, the landowner should consider implementing some of the best practices for source water protection, just to protect themselves and their loved ones from potentially contaminated water. The best practices for source water protection is a voluntary ministry guidance program. It's provided by the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, and it's free online. It aims to help protect sources of drinking water that are not protected by the Clean Water Act and or Source Protection Plan. So this usually includes most rural properties. It does also provide helpful information and suggestions on how private system owners can actually protect their drinking water sources from contamination. And the reason why the best practices were created is because there's a clear resource gap between people who receive municipally treated water and those who rely on private drinking water sources. So as you can see in this diagram, we have private system owners who have the responsibility to ensure that their drinking water is safe by doing their own treatment, testing, and they're not even trained professionals. In addition, their water distribution, the upkeep of the well itself, that's all of their responsibilities. So when you own a well, it's your responsibility to maintain it and treat it or test it, however, to make like a good, safe source of water. On the other hand, we have municipally treated water, where you have trained professionals who treat and test the water daily, and it's distributed to all of their customers in a safe manner. So because of those resource gaps, it's important to implement these best practices because it can protect human health and the environment. You can avoid the high cost of cleaning up contaminated drinking water, finding a new source, and installing water treatment systems to treat some contaminants, because you can avoid potential contamination if you do simple source water protection activities. You can also extend the life of your system. It's kind of like your house. If you take care of your house, the longer it'll last. Same thing with your drinking water system. And then you can also make informed land use planning decisions. So if you're thinking about maybe widening a driveway, maybe you don't get it too close to the well or something like that. And then lastly, increase public awareness and accountability for drinking water. This is important because many rural landowners often share the same source of drinking water. So by one person protecting it and telling others, then you'll be more likely to have less contamination in a certain area. So when you look at the best practices, you will receive some advice on how you can better protect your drinking water. And they can be like these simple measures. They're not limited to the ones that I put on the screen, but these are just a few simple ones, like testing your drinking water regularly. I know a lot of people, they'll buy a house, they'll test it when they buy it, and then they never test it again. So that being said, regularly testing your water, because water quality can change over time. So around seasonally would be kind of recommended. And then create a potential contamination activity of different activities on your property that might contaminate your well. You can implement a protection zone around your well. So you can say within 30 meters of my well, I'm not going to have my hot farm, or I'm not going to put my septic bed, stuff like that. You can visually inspect your well and septic system annually just to make sure that everything's functioning properly. You can pump out your septic system every 3 to 5 years just to make sure that it's running properly. And then you can also use eco-friendly alternatives to commercial products. So cleaning products, you can use vinegar for a lot of things. So using those environmentally friendly products as well. You can also conserve your water whenever possible. I know in our area in Quinte, we do have some water quantity issues, so conserving water is definitely helpful. Also disposing of hazardous waste at the appropriate locations. If you dispose them down the drain, it could potentially end up in your drinking water. If you do have a fuel storage tank in your house, perhaps making sure that you have a double-walled tank or even a spill tray underneath it to prevent contamination. And if you are on a waterfront property, keeping a land buffer is recommended just to reduce the surface water runoff into the surrounding bodies of water. So now that concludes our little presentation on the best practices, I will introduce our expert for today. We have Rick Lobb. Rick is a broker of records from Royal LePage Heartland Realty in Clinton, Ontario. And he's here to share his expertise on realty and rural drinking water. So you can take it away, Rick.
Thank you for that. We will just get my own presentation going here. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here today. When you asked me to do this, I really actually had to think about, am I qualified to do this? Because the reality is, although I do have an educational background in environmental technology, it is like 20 plus years ago that I took it. And, ultimately, I'm not a water specialist. I am not technically trained in water safety. But what I have done over the years is transacted in a lot of properties that are rural, that that deal in wells and different types of water sources. I've been the broker of record for Royal LePage Heartland for about 10 years, and I've been in real estate since 1996. And I do work in our rural area where we deal with properties that are independent of municipal servicing. So we encounter wells and rural water sources often. When you're dealing in a real estate transaction, there are really two main considerations with respect to water, and that is the water coming into the property and the water going out of the property. And of course, we'll be focusing this presentation on the water that is coming in. But the wastewater exiting the home would be, and Natasha was just referencing the septic system, so that's typically how wastewater is managed on a rural property in our area. So and again, I am in the Huron County area, which is over by Lake Huron. And what we typically see are 4 typical main water sources on a piece of rural property. The most common is a drilled well, which you saw reference to in Natasha's presentation. It's still common to see dug wells, although they are becoming less common over time as properties improve as we move forward. And every now and again, we'll see a property that pulls its water from a sand point, which we'll go into in a little more detail. And very rarely, although we are right beside Lake Huron, very rarely will we see water being drawn from an open body of water like a lake or an open source. So we'll start with the most rare thing that I see, and that is drawing water from, let's say in our area, Lake Huron. So this is a very uncommon type of water to be drawn. It's typically used along the shoreline in cottages, and especially where, let's say up north of us, where the Canadian Shield might make the drilling of a well very expensive or difficult, or access to the property is difficult. This water obviously is typically not potable, and it would only really ever be found in 3-season recreational cottages. In that case, then owners who are using the property would typically bring their drinking water to the residents to consume. Every now and again, we come across a sand point. It's also uncommon, but we do see them. And these are wells that are drawn from shallow aquifers. They do, because they're shallow, they're close to the surface of the ground, they do tend to be susceptible to contamination. And the other issue with these sand points is that they can fluctuate considerably. So this is sort of an example of what a sand point would be like typically. So, maybe a couple meters under the ground, you'd have a water table, and essentially you would have a pipe with a screen that is drilled down into or pounded down into the sand point, and then there would be a pump in the residence or the cottage that is drawing water from that sand point. But you can see how close that is to the surface of the ground, which obviously makes it susceptible to contamination. A dug well is another type of relatively shallow water, and they are quite common in where I trade, and you typically find them on older farms, like century farmhouses often are drawing water from a dug well. And in depth, they range usually from about 10 to 30 feet at the max. They're often hand dug, and they typically have a wide casing with a large concrete lid that you would have seen in Natasha's presentation as well. They can be susceptible to surface contamination as well, and they can also be heavily influenced by precipitation or the lack thereof. Typically, dug well water, although I have seen lots of properties where owners are drawing from a dug well and not treating the water, typically they would need to be treated in order to be considered potable by the standards set out by Ontario. So a dug well then is, ranges in depth from, as I said, maybe 10 to 30 feet. It's typically got a wider casing, and it's got the pipe down the casing that draws water from a pump that would typically be inside the residence. And that's what you would typically see a drilled well casing head to look like. The most common type of water we see drawn in our area, and probably your area, would be the drilled well. And these around here are ranging from around 100 to 300 feet in depth. And they are typically potable without the need for treatment. And due to their depth, they don't tend to be susceptible to contamination from E. coli or coliform bacteria, which I'll get into more in a bit. But this water is very typically hard. In other words, it contains a very high mineral content of iron and or calcium and other minerals that can wreak a little bit of havoc on your sinks, your faucets, your tubs, the toilets, etc. You can get lime or mineral buildup or rust buildup in your plumbing fixtures, which then shortens the life of your fixture. So a drilled well then has a much narrower casing and oftentimes is down into the ground, like I said, 100 to 300 feet. Oftentimes there's a submersible pump in the actual well casing that pulls water up to your house, and usually there's a pressure tank in the house that creates pressure for your use. And you can find, that's an example of a drilled well cap. You can find information about drilled wells at a well records website that I do believe the folks are going to get into after my presentation. So water pertaining to the real estate transaction, when we're dealing with a transaction in a rural area, we need to address the water in and the water out in an agreement of purchase and sale. And we do this by way of either conditions and or instructions in an offer. So when we're looking at a condition, then this creates a condition in the agreement that the purchase is dependent upon the quality and or the quantity of the water at the property. So this would typically be a buyer condition, meaning that the buyer is responsible to investigate into the quality or quantity, and it's up to them to look after hiring a professional and deciding whether or not they are satisfied with the result. So an example of a condition then would be this offer is conditional for a period of 10 banking days from the acceptance, upon the buyer determining in their sole and absolute discretion that the well servicing the property is potable and contains an adequate supply, failing which the offer becomes null and void and the deposit returned without deduction. In other words, it's up to the buyer to do the due diligence. If the buyer is satisfied, they can remove the condition and move forward with the deal. If they are dissatisfied, they do not remove this condition and the agreement becomes null and void. And of course, their deposit comes back if they kill the deal because they're dissatisfied. With an instruction, for example, then we will often see in an agreement that puts the onus on the seller to provide clean water to the buyer prior to the closing date. So that would typically say that the seller agrees to provide to the buyer prior to closing a water sample result showing the well servicing the property is potable and free from bacterial contamination. This does create some risk for the buyer, because if you had an unscrupulous seller who decided to take their water sample from another location because they knew that they had a contaminated well, I mean, you're at the mercy of their honesty at that with that instruction. So when we talk about water that's free from contamination in Ontario, we typically are referencing two contaminants, total coliform bacteria and E. coli bacteria. And so having presence of total coliform in your water means that it may be unsafe to drink. So Public Health Ontario says that total coliforms are a group of bacteria commonly found in animal waste, sewage, and soil and vegetation. They're often found in the intestines of animals and humans, and total coliforms are not likely to cause illness, but their presence indicates that your water supply may have been contaminated by more harmful microorganisms, or may be a sign of bacterial regrowth. So in essence, then, coliform is an indicator of whether or not your well is getting contaminated. With regard to total coliforms in a real estate transaction, it's usually a result of either an improper or contaminated test. And I will say, in my experience in real estate, most times if a test comes back, especially from a drilled well, contaminated, most times it was because of something simple like a faucet screen being left on when the sample was being taken, or maybe the lid of the sample bottle got touched or put on the counter or something like that. So the realtor might have touched the lip of the sample jar. It's very easy to contaminate these when you're doing the testing. Or the contamination also could be a result of a cracked casing or some other way that earth or dirt is getting into the well. If there's presence of E. coli, then Ontario says the water will be unsafe to drink. So E. coli is a specific member of the coliform group found in the intestines of animals and humans. And although most strains of E. coli bacteria are harmless, the presence of E. coli in well water indicates fecal contamination, and that means that there most likely are harmful bacteria, viruses, and parasites in your well water. So E. coli was the issue that happened back in the 2000 era up in Walkerton, and that made a lot of people sick back then. So E. coli then in a real estate transaction, when we see an E. coli count on a water sample, this creates more of a contamination concern, because it may be caused, again, by improper or contaminated testing, but also could be caused from contamination of the well from human or animal waste. So it would be definitely more common to see coliform contamination versus E. coli contamination. And as we stated before, the more shallow that well is, the higher the risk of contamination that well will have. If E. coli is present, it's usually a sign of a larger problem, and I already referenced the Walkerton issue in May of 2000. The allowable bacteria count then for a clean water sample would be 0 to 5 units per 100 milliliter of coliform and 0 units per 100 milliliter for E. coli. Testing for these two bacteria are typically conducted by either the buyer or the seller. The realtors have been known to do the sampling for their clients, but it is typically frowned upon due to the potential liability. So it's very common for realtors to take the samples for their clients, but we are always recommended that we do not do that. It is easy to contaminate these samples, so the testing needs to be conducted with care. And I already referenced these, but examples of sample contamination, so touching the mouth of the sample bottle, not removing the faucet screen, putting the lid on the counter with the open side touching the counter, etc. So then if you're in a transaction, a real estate transaction, and a well test fails, does that mean that things are going to not come together? Not necessarily. Normal procedure would suggest that you would take 1 or 2 more samples just to confirm that the contamination is due to the well or the source and not the actual, that the sample that was conducted wasn't contaminated by user error. We would always try to determine the cause of the contamination. And then we would have a contracting company come to shock the well, and then after a period of time, do some retesting. Typically, if the buyer of said property wants to continue on with the transaction, or if the buyer decides to get out of the transaction, and then, in order for a future sale, a seller will often want to install a water purification system in order to deal with the water that's coming in. And typically, we would see a UV system with a sediment filter that would be the sort of the least expensive but highest quality way to deal with sterilization of a well, of that water that's coming from that well into a house that's being used by the residents. The cost usually starts around $600 for that kind of a thing. And we do see these units commonly used, especially on properties with dug wells or drawing from sandpoints. And again, this is probably the most cost-effective solution for an otherwise expensive problem, because if you have a dug well and that well has a coliform count, then the best sort of solution to that problem is to have a well drilled. But of course, those wells, around here, they usually start at $12,000 to $15,000 at the low end. So, that can be an expensive fix. Other considerations when we're talking about, and this often doesn't come into play on a real estate transaction, but typically well water that's coming in from a drilled well rates very high on a hardness scale. So when anybody is purchasing a rural property, it's good for the realtor to advise them that, having super hard water can reduce the lifespan of your fixtures, and you may want to have some kind of a softening system installed that removes iron, calcium, I think magnesium as well, from the water using salt. And then, of course, these softeners can often be rented, which again can come up in an agreement of purchase and sale. And so, of course, if a seller has a rented water softener, then during a transaction, a buyer would need to know whether or not they're okay with assuming the rental on that water softener. I know that Natasha is going to talk a little bit about this as well, but up in our area, it is not common to run further testing on our water sources, which in a lot of ways is very odd. We only test for 2 things. We only test for coliform and E. coli. We don't test for arsenic. We generally don't test for VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds. And it is possible to have those tests done, but in my experience in real estate, I've never had a transaction where a buyer has wanted further testing. And there are labs that can do that if you want further testing, but they come at a cost, whereas the E. coli and coliform testing is free for the public. And again, other concerns to be testing for would be nitrates, heavy metals, VOCs, sulfates, etc. And there is a link for testing labs in Ontario. I got this from the ontario.ca website. If any of you viewers are interested in the further testing of well water, that's the page you would want to visit. Some other water considerations, and again, this is something, and the reason that I'm here today is simply because I got a phone call from a water source protection professional in this area because I had a listing of a property in a source protection zone. And prior to that, about 4 years ago, I had never heard of the source protection zones. When I got the call from Mary Lynn, and she actually really threw me off because I had never heard of this, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this listing's in a protection zone. What am I going to do? As it turns out, protection zones are easy to identify by way of the interactive mapping that we have at our disposal through the Ministry of the Environment. And that mapping shows you where these sources are and the protection zones are. And had I had the knowledge prior to that listing, I would have realized that where my listing was located was in one of these zones. And so as a realtor, and if there's any realtors in this room, you will want to be aware that this is a resource for you to use when you're going to get a listing or you're going to show a property that's in the rural area. You might want to check this website to find out if the property is in a source protection zone. If it is, the main concerns tend to be specific to industrial or commercial uses where you use a lot of large quantities of nasty chemicals. Typically, if you have a residential listing in a source protection zone, it's not going to come into play in an agreement, but it is worthy of note for sure. So that's my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to chime in.
Thanks, Rick. That was great. We do have some pre-submitted questions, so I'm just going to share my screen. I'm sure many of you are aware that we do have, in the registration process, we have our question pre-submission area. So this is where most of our questions have come from. I'm going to let Trent ask the questions because there are some questions that are related to conservation staff as well. So now we'll start off.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. So our first question here is, what is the importance of testing well water for microbiological and chemical contaminants that may be present? I'll let you start with that.
Okay,
Yeah,
so who's taking that one?
If you want to, you can. I'll take the next one.
We want to make sure we're testing for microbiological and chemical contaminants to make sure that that you don't run into future health issues in the rural property that you purchase, and to make sure that that somebody who's selling a piece of property is well aware of what it is that's in their well that they're consuming on a daily basis. So, and again, the E. coli and coliform testing, extremely popular. I mean, it happens every time there's a well or a non-municipal water source on a property, but rarely do people go further and test for chemical contaminants.
So then if you did not test your water and it happens to be contaminated, what are some of the risks associated with consuming drinking water that would not meet Ontario's drinking water standards?
Yeah, I'll
Natasha?
take that one. So that question, a lot of public health professionals can probably answer it better than we can. But risk associated with consuming water that doesn't meet the Ontario drinking water standards could result in like gastrointestinal illnesses, or even there's something called blue baby syndrome that is an effect of nitrates. So there's many different illnesses that you can get. It depends on the contamination and how much you're drinking of it, and how long you've drank the contaminated water. So it does depend on the type of contaminant, but generally it is not a good idea to be drinking water that doesn't meet the Ontario drinking water standards.
And just to add to that anecdotally, we have seen situations in our past where, you know, an elderly farming couple is drawing water from a dug well. They go to sell the property. They find out that the water has coliform contamination that's on a very large or significant scale. And they've been living there drinking the water for years and years and never seemingly got adverse health impacts from it. But it's one of those things where you just think, oh my God, how do these people continue to drink this water for this many years and not get ill?
And there could be some immunity kind of building up too, that then if they had guests come over drinking that for the first time, which would not go well. All right. The next question is, what kind of drinking water test should realtors do when selling a rural property?
So again, you know, it is we have to, when we're transacting in Ontario, we have to test for E. coli and we have to test for coliform. However, if I'm buying, if I'm a realtor representing a buyer who's buying a property that has a drilled well, I'm going to want to advise that person that they can have the option, they do have the option to test for a wide array of contaminants, because that's just good due diligence. So from a must-do perspective, we have to test for E. coli and coliform. But you know, would I advise people to do further testing? Always. Have many people done it? Never.
All right, thanks. So this, I think Natasha's going to answer this one. What kind of setbacks are required on a rural property, i.e. for septic systems, wells?
So for setbacks, there are a lot of different setback requirements, and according to the Ontario Building Code. So this little figure here from the Septic Smart booklet from 2023 is a good visualization of it. So if you look at it, the different types of wells, the ones that we mentioned, like a dug well and a drilled well. So for example, drilled wells, they need to be at least 15 meters from a tank. And then a dug well has got to be at least 30 meters. Additionally, it is kind of smart not to have large trees near your wells, because let's say a willow, they really get attracted to wells and they might even try and burst through the casing to get to that source. So yeah, if you are looking for a full list of setbacks, I recommend referring to the Ontario Building Code. But these are just a few general setbacks for wells.
Yeah, and if you have more, like to learn more specifically about septics and rural water, you can take a look at our last webinar, which was specifically on that topic. And you can also look up the Septic Smart handbook, which is available online. So the next question, what is the best way to ensure a clean and good flowing well for buyers?
I can take that one. So with ensuring a clean and good flowing well for buyers, it can be a little tricky, specifically. So speaking about our area, Prince Edward County is generally known for having low quantity at times of drinking water. So in terms of good flow, it might be difficult to ensure that your buyer would get good flow in an area that has historic low water. That being said, you can always contact a licensed well contractor to see if you can do anything about improving the flow or even deepening the well. And then in terms of making sure it's clean, you can do the testing that we had mentioned, so E. coli and total coliforms, but there are licensed laboratories in Ontario that you can test for multiple parameters. And then if you do see anything that is of concern, potentially putting in a treatment system might be best to ensure that it's a clean, good well.
And I'll just add to that, as far as ensuring like good flowing, or I'm gonna say quantity. I think that's the way I interpret that. We have companies up in our area, I don't know if you do there, I imagine you do, who would be able to do quantity testing on wells. So they do flow tests, and they'll basically tell you sort of, it'll give you an idea of well quantity based on the flow of water that comes out of it. And in the rare occasion where we do have quantity issues in our area, typically the fix for that means drilling deeper into the earth. So drilling down deeper will usually correct our quantity issue.
Yeah, I think you kind of answered our next question there a bit. So should a potential new homeowner of a property with a private well request a well yield pumping test to confirm water quantity and water quality samples during the home inspection?
I would say with regard to, so a buyer would usually want the pumping test and the quality test. And oftentimes it's made a condition in an agreement. So the buyer hires the company to come in and do a quantity test, to do the quality test as well, and make that a condition of the agreement.
Right. So that's all our pre-submitted question. We did just have one come in from Kyle Smith. He says, realtors in our area dose wells with bleach to get a clean sample. Does this happen elsewhere? Oftentimes neighboring wells draw the bleach in. What would be the best way to stop this practice?
So we generally, as far as I'm aware, and I'm a broker of record and a manager of about 40 realtors in our area. If I heard of one of our realtors practicing this at a rural property, I would probably immediately terminate them. But it's responsible, upstanding realtors, of which there are many, typically would not engage in any kind of activity that would, where they would essentially shock the well. Now, having said that, the company that I was referencing before about testing for quality and quantity, we have had scenarios where a well might have a coliform count, and the first line of defense for that this company will do is shock the well with chlorine. And then after the well is shocked, then they allow the well to run for a period of time to clean it out and make sure that the chlorine has been removed. Then do more sampling, and then you would want to allow time to pass before sampling again to see if you have any regrowth of the coliform that you're trying to avoid. So I would say, to answer Kyle specifically, that activity does not typically happen around here. And but if I was suspecting that it was, what I would want to do is I would want to make sure that there was a long time span between when I presumed that they were shocking the well with chlorine to when I was actually retesting it. And I would probably also want to send some water away to test it for chlorine and see what the chlorine count would be in that well sample.
Did you have anything to add to that, Natasha? Or
well, there is on the Public Health Ontario website, there is a shocking calculator. So you can calculate how much bleach to put into your well. That being said, if you are not comfortable with doing that, always recommend speaking with a professional first, or even hiring a professional to do it. Because I know in my experience, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing it because I don't know what I'm doing. So I would definitely contact a professional if you are interested in shocking a well.
great. We did just have one other question from Keith. Says many people are moving from the city to rural areas. do you find these people are turned off by the idea of properties with wells and septic systems? And if so, how do you address this?
So yeah, the answer to that is yes. And it's interesting to see when you know, urban people move to a rural area and they have no idea that a property in a rural area is essentially self-sufficient, meaning, you know, it draws its own water in and it sends its own water out, and the municipality has nothing to do with it. So I try and educate people who are unfamiliar with wells and septic systems that, you know, that system of living is actually, you know, it has its risks and it has its requirement for maintenance. But overall, if you have a large property and you have a nice deep drilled well and you have a properly functioning septic system, that these things can work in a very smooth fashion if they are maintained properly and regularly. So, but to answer your specific question, do I find that they're turned off? I would say not necessarily turned off, but they are unaware of the realities that come with living in a rural property that is essentially self-sufficient.
Right, makes sense. Yeah.
So to further answer your question, how to address it, you have to address it with advice and education.
Exactly. Yeah, and if I think part of the best practices program for municipal or non-municipal source protection is trying to address that sort of information gap there, that there's all this information and programs in place for people on municipal water, but not so much on the rural side. So if you'd like more information on that, definitely look up those best practices that we've linked in the chat. Otherwise, that looks like all of our questions.
Yeah, so before everyone leaves, we'd love to hear from you. So I'm going to just run a poll. This will just help us with future webinars. So if you don't mind, I'm just launching it now. There's 6 questions. If you could just take a moment to do that, I would greatly appreciate it. All right, well, I'll leave the poll running for now, but without further ado, we want to thank everyone who attended today, and for those who couldn't attend but are watching the recording, thank you. And a big thanks to Rick Lobb for sharing all of his valuable experience and expertise in the realty world. We do have a webinar coming up in January about rural drinking water and human health. Sorry, not January, February. Oh my gosh, March 2024. The date is to be determined, but it will be up on our registration website soon as we know the date. And if you have any questions, you can contact any of our panelists. We have Kelsey and Haven from Cataraqui, Trent from the Lower Trend Conservation, and myself from Quinning Conservation, and Marika from Rideau Valley. So yeah, without further ado, thank you for everything, and keep being well wise.
And sorry, Natasha, someone just said they're not seeing the feedback survey. I know there was.
Oh, if you're on a mobile device,
yeah,
it may pop up as like a banner, and then you can click to say view polls and then so on. I'm just going to stop the recording now.
There's also a comment about